lots of people coming in at the top of the hour here. Welcome. We'll get started in just a shake here. All right, I will kick things off. Welcome to everyone. I'm excited to have you all here and to talk about cybersecurity and insurance. I invite you to put your name, your company, where you're connecting to from in the chat. We've got clients from, I think, multiple states and provinces here, using Linux, using Windows, all sorts of technology. So maybe put in your state and your province or your city and get to see where everyone's connecting from. So this topic is very important to me, I think to all of us, as I've mentioned in the emails, with all the ransomware going on, and we hear about the news almost every day, clients getting compromised, governments, police, all sorts of jurisdictions getting compromised that way. And the requirements are changing around insurance. And so a couple stories from our side. We had a client a few years ago who got crypto lockered. They had ransomware. They had to pay it. Fortunately, it was covered by their insurance. But today they would not qualify for the insurance that saved them then. They got about $50,000 back to cover the ransom and the cost to recover. We had another client, or actually they weren't a client, but they were in trouble as they had gotten hacked, and their IT guy was out of his depth, and he asked for help. So they brought us in and we helped to respond to that. And they thought they had a cyber policy. We looked at it, encouraged them to call, but really it didn't cover anything at all. So they had to pay for all the recovery, to restore data, rebuild servers and such. And as an IT company owner, it's been concerning seeing some of my peers in the industry also running IT companies, managed service providers, getting compromised, and not only them, but also their clients as well, and leading to $1 million plus ransoms. And I don't want that to be me. So we've upped our game on our policies and working with the clients to do the same. And so it's been on my mind for over a year to do a webinar specifically on the insurance side of this. And so we got in contact with Derek recently, who's with Hub, and I had a good chat with him, a couple of chats, and really realized he's an expert in this area. I'm like, hey, this is a great opportunity to bring him as a speaker to our clients. So that's why he's here today. And I learned a lot from that conversation, and it's been very useful. And I think you'll learn a lot from that as well. And then also with me is Ian, who is our cloud and security expert, and working with our clients around their best practices and projects, all sorts of things there. So he'll share some stories and current news, what's going on in the news today, after Derek's presentation. And then this is being presented on behalf of Kirkhoff Technologies, which is our Windows IT support division, and Crafty Penguin. So looking at our list today, it's about 50-50 as to who showed up. So welcome, whichever side you're on, and this content will apply to everyone, whether you're business, nonprofit, using Linux or Windows. So with that said, I will hand it off to Derek, who will share a screen and introduce himself.
Thanks, Wim. Yeah, let me just get the control here.
Plakila, can you make sure that Derek has access? There we go, yeah.
All righty. I just need to move this out to the side. Perfect. Thanks again for having me today. So we're going to chat about cyber risk management, how insurance can be sort of that last line of defense, or that safety net, but also what can you do on the front end to not only be able to get cyber insurance, but to keep it in place for renewals. And also just how to protect your systems from being hacked in the first place. And obviously Wim and his team are experts in that, so I'll have Ian chime in a little bit on some of that. But let's jump right to it. So first I wanted to chat quickly about the privacy legislation, because this really is what moves the cyber policies today. So obviously if there wasn't privacy legislation in place, companies could just sweep any breach under the rug, and they knew, as they knew there wouldn't be any ramifications. But because of these legislations, it keeps people honest. And in Canada, the main thing that we focus on is this real risk of significant harm definition. And that's essentially if you had a privacy breach, or if you had the potential for someone to incur financial loss, or even something like humiliation, you would have to notify those affected individuals and potentially set them up for credit monitoring, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And so basically the privacy commissioners in Canada use this definition of a real risk of significant harm as that threshold. If it passes the threshold, you have to notify the privacy commissioner, and then basically your life is in their hands. And so how do we determine what is a real risk of significant harm? Typically, that's going to be done by a privacy breach coach. And these come with a cyber policy. However, if you don't have a cyber policy, you could certainly incur those costs outside of a policy. But basically, you would want to retain legal counsel to determine whether that real risk of significant harm has been breached. And if so, then they would advise that, yes, you do have to notify the privacy commissioner. And again, like I said, your life is sort of in their hands moving forward. Now, Canada isn't obviously the only place with privacy legislation. There's legislation around the world, but some of the key jurisdictions that we watch are the US, where now all 50 states have their own privacy legislation laws. We also see really strict privacy legislation in the EU, which I'm sure everybody is familiar with now, with GDPR coming out in 2018. But coming back to the US, California has really been the main state that has been pushing the requirements that we see today. They're definitely the most strict out there of the 50 US states. And again, if you had someone in Canada, so say you're a Canadian domiciled firm, you have a privacy breach here in Canada, but it affects people that reside in the US or in the EU or potentially other jurisdictions around the world. The requirement actually says that you have to notify those individuals, or you have to go along with the privacy legislation where they reside. So if you have customers in the US or customers in the EU or other places around the world with their own privacy legislation, you actually need your breach coach here in Canada or people that you're retaining around the world to guide you on what the different privacy laws around the world are, so that you can stay on the right side of those. So again, a simple example, Canadian firm has a privacy breach and they have a whole bunch of US clients, and they're spread across the different states. Where it gets a little bit messy and where we would bring in a US breach coach is to navigate all 50 of the different privacy legislations that are out there, because it can get quite messy, and everybody has a little bit of a different stance when it comes to notification, the timing to do so, fines and penalties, you name it. One example that we always bring up is the Uber example. So back in, I think it was about 2016, they had a ransomware attack which compromised a bunch of their driver information. At the time, they decided to sweep it under the rug. So they did what we're saying not to do. Sure enough, it came out a couple of years later, and they were subject to about $40 to $50 million in fines just from the attorney generals in the US. And that does not count any class action lawsuits or other things that followed. So dealing with these things appropriately and upfront is absolutely paramount to make sure that fines and penalties aren't following down the road. So let's talk about what we've seen really since the start of 2020. So since all of us started to, for the most part, work from home during COVID, we saw cyber claims rise dramatically. And here we have a chart from our friends at CFC. CFC is one of the major cyber providers in the world. And so they're a really good resource when it comes to the distribution of claims. And so as you can see here in that light blue color, ransomware takes about 75% of all claims. The light green color is theft of funds. In other words, we call this social engineering. This is where your team is duped into wiring money to the wrong people. For those that aren't maybe familiar with ransomware, I'll quickly mention that this is where a hacker is able to infect your system with malware. They are able to encrypt all of your data and basically hold you ransom. So they'll say, you can have the decryption key to release all of your encrypted data, but it's going to cost you $1 million worth of Bitcoin or something like that. And again, that's where the cyber policy would come in to support you and surround you with all the experts to not only negotiate with the hacker, but also to have $1 million of Bitcoin just on the ready to be paid, because that's quite difficult if you're not working with professionals in that space. So you can see that between ransomware and that social engineering component, that's really what's driving the claims and the severity that we see today. Moving forward, you can also see that for ransomware, the severity has grown exponentially really since the start of 2018, and this trend really has continued well into 2021, going in the top right direction. So what used to be a very common demand, it might be $500 or it might be $5,000. Well, now we're seeing the average demand be well into the six figures. And as Wim alluded, we're now seeing it into 7 and 8 figures awards, or settlements, I should say, that these people are looking for. There's one particular insurance company in 2021, earlier this year, that paid out $40 million to get their data back. They're a very well-known insurance company. I'm sure most people would have heard of them at some point. They are US based, and again, a 40 million ransomware settlement was required in order to get their data back and get up and running. And as a broker, being in this space, working with this particular insurer quite frequently, it was about 2 to 3 weeks before they could even return emails. So it was quite devastating for them, not to mention the amount that they paid out. So this is definitely factoring into why we've seen a dramatic shift in how underwriters are viewing these policies. So again, this is 6 things that cyber underwriters love. And this is a document that was provided to us, again, from CFC. And so what they've said is, and they're not unique in the thought process. Most insurers are taking these same stances. But basically, they want you to at least, at the very minimum, have these 6 security protocols in place if you're to be able to get insurance moving forward or to be able to renew your existing policy. So the first one there is unused RDP ports are closed and open ones are protected. So basically, ideally, most companies are wanting no remote desktop protocol ports to be opened, especially those that are externally facing. They want people to be logging in remotely through VPNs or some other protected means. And again, I'm going to have Ian chime in here in a second once I'm done with this slide, and he can speak a little bit more to the technical side. But basically, what they're doing to determine whether you have an open RDP port is they are conducting non-invasive scans of your system. So it's not a penetration test, but it's basically they're looking at your publicly facing domains and they're scanning just like a hacker would. And basically they're going and jiggling door handles and just seeing which company is letting them in. And they're hoping to do that and alert you to that before a hacker does. And so when we go to place a new policy or renew a policy, we're typically getting a list of potential vulnerabilities that the company has to fix before they're eligible to get coverage. And one of the key offenders is this RDP port. So if that's open, you would be notified of it and you would have to close it or protect it so it's not visible from the internet. The next one there, and this is probably the most important one that we're seeing, is multi-factor authentication. They want multi-factor authentication turned on across all key business software, including email, remote access, privileged access, you name it. They're basically looking for that to be in place. Some insurers are taking a softer stance than others. Some are basically non-renewing if you don't have it in place. Others are giving you a little bit of a time window. So maybe it's 1 month or 90 days or 6 months or something like that. As long as you have a process in place, some are being a little bit more lenient on this, but it is definitely a question that's being asked. Next one there is there's a data management strategy in place. So essentially what the underwriters want to know or want to understand is, what information do you have? How is it being protected? Who has access to it? And basically all questions around that. So having good data hygiene is really important, and we want to be able to articulate that to the underwriters to make sure that they're comfortable with the risk. On the right side of the page, we have systems are running endpoint detection and response. And so no longer are just simple antivirus and firewalls good enough. They're really wanting that proactive search and destroy type product where it's alerting you actively to any potential threats versus more of a passive system. And again, I'm sure Ian will have more to speak on this. Next one there is regular backups are taken using best practice. So they're wanting obviously regular backups, hopefully on a daily basis, maybe weekly, something like that. But they're also wanting it to be obviously tested on a regular basis because you'd be surprised how many people they have a ransomware attack. They say, hey, no problem. We have good backups. They bring in the backups. They go to restore from backup. And unfortunately, they're corrupted or they're just not able to be used because they haven't been tested. Where possible, it would be great to see this air gapped, meaning it's not connected to the internet at all, so that it's very, very difficult for a hacker to obviously compromise that. Again, I'm sure Ian might have some comments on that. Finally, with respect to the last one here, we've got a good attitude towards risk management is demonstrated. So they want to make sure that there's somebody in the organization that is wearing that privacy best practices hat. They are in charge of privacy. They are potentially rolling out employee training to all of the employees and staff of the company, including contractors if they have access to your system. They're wanting to make sure, again, that you know, you're trying to make improvements, that we're creating that what we call human firewall. You know, humans, our employees, are typically our biggest offenders. They love to click on things that they shouldn't, and they love to let, you know, potentially hackers in the back door and circumvent all the good security that we've put in place. So making sure that we have a good attitude towards this privacy risk management is huge. But Ian, I think this is a great time for you to chime in. So do you want to have some comments on some of these things that the underwriters are looking for?
Yeah, so there's a lot of solutions that one of the things I would say is that there's nothing on this page that is really a big roadblock. There's nothing that we don't have solutions implemented for in customers right across the board. If you're a customer of ours on our Windows MSP team, much of this is in place for you, and you generally get reports on these kinds of things and quarterly with our proactive reporting. These are the same things when we do an assessment on a network for a new client, or sometimes organization will just bring us in to give them a security assessment. These are the same sorts of things that we're looking for. So I think one of the biggest takeaways that I would say is don't look at this list and be like, oh, this is going to be impossible, or this is going to be too expensive, or something like that. This is right across the board, whether it's, you know, insurance is getting into this in the last few years. From an IP perspective, this has been our go-to, a pretty standard go-to list for us for decade. So there's nothing new here. There's no big surprises, and it's all stuff that we've got solutions for.
Thanks, Ian. Yeah, I think that's the key, and that's what the feedback that we've heard as well from our other clients is that this looks scary, right? When you put all these minimum requirements out there, it looks scary. It looks like it's going to cost a lot. But I would agree with Ian that a lot of our clients, the actual feedback it was quite simple. And these were easy switches, easy fixes to put in place. So really shouldn't be very costly, shouldn't be very time consuming. And so that's certainly good news moving forward.
Yeah, I'll just jump in. So at the beginning, I shared the two stories of the existing client and this other company that got hacked. Both of them, I believe it was through the open RDP. And both of them had been warned about it, but declined to do anything about it.
It was in both cases RDP that was open to the public internet.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's easy pickings for the hackers, and that's why we're trying to alert you guys or you know, anybody to these types of things before the hackers do, right? And it again can be a very easy fix, as I'm sure Wim and Ian would attest. Good to move on, both.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay.
Good.
So let's talk a little bit about what a typical cyber policy would have in place. You're going to have, you know, two sides for sure, and that would be the first party and the third party. And then sometimes you'll also get some cyber crime, and I'll touch on that in a moment. But in Canada, for sure, where we see most of the cost is on the first party side. In the US, we do see a little bit more third party, you know, there's more liability concerns, there's more class action lawsuits, more single lawsuits, things like that coming out. We don't see as much of that in Canada. So in the US, it would be maybe a little bit more evenly weighted, but definitely in Canada, most costs are under the first party part of the policy. And these would be all of the costs that you have to incur to right the ship, so to speak. So you have some sort of privacy breach, or you've got a cyber attack, and you need to figure out what happened. You need to retain that privacy breach coach. You need to notify affected individuals. You need to potentially set them up for credit monitoring. You need to restore from backup. You need to, you know, have that forensic team come in and do a full diagnostic of what happened. You know, what did they steal? Are they still in the system? Are there any backdoors? Things like that. All of these costs that I'm describing would be covered by this policy. And the good news is that, again, these policies come with a panel of experts. And so you don't have to go out and retain your own people. Your own IT people that you work with currently will certainly assist in this process, but we'll actually bring in an expert forensic team to assist your IT team in diagnosing exactly what happened. Again, you might have your own legal counsel that you work with, but in this case, we're going to bring in someone whose only job is to look at these types of privacy breaches and knows all of the privacy laws around the world, and to be able to advise you appropriately. Other things that are included under this would be, things like business interruption. So if you had a net income loss as a result of your system being compromised, in the example of that insurance company, they were basically down for 2 to 3 weeks. I'm sure it cost them a lot of business because people weren't able to place insurance policies with them. No doubt they probably placed them with other insurers. And so as a result, they probably had that net income loss, which, again, if you take your own example, I'm sure there's lots of different industries on the call today, but basically at the end of the day, if you can't operate because your system is down and you suffer that net income loss, that would be covered. And the key is that not only does this protect your own systems, but it also protects third-party IT providers that you rely on. So if you rely on a cloud hosting provider and they go down, and as a result, you can't conduct business, this policy should extend to that. And similarly, the next one you see there is system failure. So if your own IT guys unfortunately make some sort of error, or they're trying to upload some new software and it doesn't jive with what you have currently and it crashes the system, and as a result you have to rebuild things, and that takes a few weeks of time and you lose business, that system failure component would be covered as well. Moving forward, regulatory fines and penalties. So if the privacy commissioner does come and say, okay, you need to pay $100,000 worth of fines and penalties, this insurance policy can respond and pay those fines, but the caveat is they can only do so where it's allowed by law. So it depends on the jurisdiction, and every jurisdiction is a little bit different. So the privacy, the insurance company and the privacy breach coach, everybody will try to help navigate, where those fines and penalties have to lie. Crisis management costs, that refers to hiring a PR firm or a call center or other costs incurred to, again, you're probably going to have an influx of calls and questions and other things. So, if the newspaper shows up at your door, we want to make sure that you're properly scripted on what you're going to say to alleviate, concern and try to put that, any concerns to rest. Cyber extortion cost there. So this would be all of the costs to negotiate the ransom, to actually pay the ransom. Any other costs associated with that transaction would be covered by this policy. And then finally, we have hardware replacement. And so again, if your hardware gets affected, not just the software, but the hardware gets affected. So, because of some virus, your laptop won't work, your server won't work. That's not going to be covered by your property policy, because that's, contemplating things like theft or fire or flood, not a cyber peril. In this case, that bridges the gap between, the physical world and the cyber world. So those are all the first party coverages. As mentioned, on the third party side, we don't see this a ton in Canada, certainly more frequently in the US. But this covers three main things, and it's privacy liability, network security, and multimedia liability. So privacy liability is essentially where you have a data breach in your system and you need to, again, notify affected individuals. They pick up their phone, they start a lawsuit with their lawyer. You get sued as a result of that privacy breach. This policy would pay for any defense, any potential settlements or awards that come out of that process. Network security, that refers to more where your system is compromised by a virus and now your system spreads that virus to a third party. They suffer some sort of financial loss and they sue you for transmitting that virus. This could also be, a denial of service attack. And a denial of service attack is basically where so much traffic is focused on one site that it takes it offline. It overloads the servers and it takes it offline. Sometimes what a hacker will do is they will compromise a bunch of different servers and they will route all of that traffic or that computing power at one source or at one destination. And if they take it offline and that company, investigates and they figure out that your servers were connected with that denial of service attack, they could sue you. And that's where the network security piece would come in. And then finally, there's multimedia liability. And this is a little bit of a weird one that sneaks into this policy, but this refers to your online media, your online presence for the company. So you have a website, you have social media channels. if you infringe on someone's intellectual property, so say you use a client's logo without their permission and they sue you, or you use photos, videos, things like that. Typically where we see claims on this side of the policy would be where you put out a promotional YouTube video, and in the background you use some infringing music of Sony's, and then Sony comes knocking because you're a company with deep pockets, and they try to get some money out of you for using their music inappropriately. So that's where we have seen some claims on that side of the policy. And then finally, moving on to cyber crime coverages. This is where some policies will include this, some policies will not. And this is a little bit of a hybrid between a cyber and a crime policy. So some people would have a separate crime policy that would likely cover most of these things. But if you don't, this is an easy way that you can check off some of these of the most important coverages that you would want to see. So going back to my initial pie chart with social engineering, where again your team is duped into sending money to the wrong people. We see this all the time, unfortunately. One of my clients just wired $600,000 to the wrong people, and fortunately they sent it to the US, and the only reason they found out was the Department of Homeland Security and the Secret Service actually reached out to them and said, hey, we've been monitoring this fraudulent account and you just wired a whole bunch of money to it. Unfortunately, doesn't look like they're going to get the money back. They tried to claw the money back. Doesn't look like it's going to be successful. So luckily, they do have this cybercrime policy in place. And so we are expecting payment to be made under that social engineering provision. The next one there is funds transfer and computer fraud. This is essentially where a hacker is able to send fraudulent instructions to your bank, asking them to wire money to the wrong people, or they actually hack into your accounts and wire the money that way. So that also would be covered by the cybercrime. And then finally, we see telephone hacking. And this is, for those companies using a VoIP phone system, this is where we have seen people attack that system, and they've routed long distance calls through the VoIP system. You, of course, get the bill, but they get the long distance calls. So not a great one to get stuck with. We have seen this before, and it would have been covered if they had this policy in place. There are a couple other small fringe coverages that you might expect to see under a cybercrime, like invoice manipulation, things like that. I'm not going to go into it in full detail because it depends on the insurance company, what's included and what isn't. But these three are typically the ones that you would expect to see on just about every policy. So we'll certainly have questions at the end, but I'll move on for now, and we can always circle back if there are things that people want to ask about. So we have a few slides left. One is that I wanted to focus on is common objections. So when I'm out speaking with my clients or prospects, here are some of the main things that I hear. We don't have sensitive information. Well, if you have employees or if you have clients, it's very likely that you have sensitive information. It's very hard to avoid sensitive information in today's day and age. So if you have, let's say a website with a portal with username and login data, password data, if people are logging into your portals, that would be sensitive. That's something that people don't typically think of. If you're collecting credit cards for payment, that would be sensitive. If you have employees, you have all their employee records, you have their social insurance numbers or social security numbers, that would be sensitive. So it's very likely that every company has some element of sensitive information. And so we would want to, obviously make sure that that's protected. The other thing is that, and I'll talk about this in a moment, but this sort of relates to we don't have sensitive information. A lot of people then say, okay, well, we do, but we remove the risk because we outsource it to third-party providers. So this is all sitting with Amazon Web Services in the cloud, or it's with a third-party hosting provider. So that's not our responsibility anymore. And unfortunately, it is. You can outsource the data, but you cannot outsource the risk. All right. So you're ultimately responsible to your clients for where you put their data. They ultimately aren't going to go and sue Amazon because Amazon had a breach. They're going to sue you. You can try to sue Amazon, but it's likely not going to go very far. So that's the fourth one on the list there. Coming back to the second one, our IT systems will not be penetrated, no doubt, because you're working with Wim or Ian. Unfortunately, going back to that human firewall element, no matter if you're spending millions or billions or hundreds of thousands of dollars on data security, if you have Bill or Dave or Susie sitting in a corner, clicking on links that they shouldn't be clicking on. Unfortunately, they can bypass a lot of the security that's being put in place, and things are no doubt going to slip through the cracks. So we really need to build up that human firewall and that actual firewall to make sure that we have sort of that two-pronged safety approach. The third one here, we are too small to be a target. And so going back to when I was talking about how hackers are scanning the internet and they're looking for open RDP ports, or they're looking for other vulnerabilities, that's often the case, is they're using the same scanning software that the insurance companies are now using to alert you of issues. And they don't even necessarily know who they're targeting. They just know that someone has let them in the back door. And so this kind of is a little bit of an aside, but if you ever are targeted by a ransomware attack, we always say to negotiate with the hackers through an anonymous email address, because they might not even know who they've targeted. They just know that they have somebody. And if you are the CEO of Coca-Cola and you respond to these hackers and say, hey, you've got our data, give it back, or what do you want to get this back? Well, now they know that they have Coca-Cola, and they may not have known that going into the hacking session. So just a quick aside there on that piece. Again, if there's any questions, we can take them at the end. Just a couple more slides to go. So if you already have a cyber policy, or you're looking to get a cyber policy, often the question is, well, what limit do we choose? My neighbor has a 5 million limit. My other neighbor has a 1 million limit. I've been offered a 500,000 limit by my broker. How do I know what is right for me? And what I would strongly avoid is looking at your neighbors to see what they have and asking, well, if they have 1 million, then I'll take 1 million, because everybody has a unique set of circumstances that we need to take into we need to take into account. And the example I want to give you is Target, Home Depot, and Anthem. So these were, historical losses in the US that we actually know that they all had 100 million limits of cyber in place. So they all had a 100 million limit, and it's very likely that they were dealing with the same broker or similar brokers, and they were looking around the industry to say, hey, well, if I'm Home Depot and Target has 100 million, well, I should have 100 million too. The problem with that is all three of them suffered losses of 300 million. And so they were 200 million underinsured. And so again, not a great way to look at your neighbors and try to figure out, what's an appropriate limit. What we want to do is the next point here. We want to, customize a benchmark for you alone. So we would look at the number of sensitive records that you hold, not what your neighbors hold, what you hold. And we would also look at your potential business interruption exposure, because again, you're going to have a different set of circumstances than your neighbor or other people in the industry. So you might be able to get up faster than your neighbor, or your neighbor might be able to get up faster than you. And so we take that all into consideration, and then we have some calculators, which I'll show you on the next slide, which will help to determine exactly what limit you should select. And finally, what I wanted to alert you to was you'll see a lot of things titled cyber in the insurance marketplace, and some are not as equal as the others. So what you may see is under a property or a general liability policy, we call them bolt-on cyber products. And basically they'll typically come with a 50 or 100,000 limit. And the price is likely going to be $100 or $50 or $200 or something like that. That's a pretty good tip-off that that's not the policy that you want to have in place. Typically, these small policies, they only cover mainly the third-party exposure, which I already mentioned isn't the sort of the biggest exposure. We really want that first-party side covered. And for sure, if they do include some first-party cover, it's very, very likely that they exclude ransomware, which again accounts for about 75% of all claims. So it looks good, it's called cyber, but at the end of the day, it just doesn't stack up to the standalone variety that we would expect to see. So in today's day and age, if you're not paying sort of $1,000 sort of at a minimum for cyber, it's very likely that you have maybe a deficient product. So again, I would be checking with your brokers to ensure that it actually does cover what you think it's supposed to cover. So last slide here, before we get into questions, is just to show you what this breach calculator looks like. So I mentioned that we tabulate, how many sensitive records you have, basically meaning how many individuals would sue you if their information was compromised. So if you have 1,000 unique individuals that might sue you, we would type in 1,000 into this breach calculator, and then it would spit out a total cost. And so in this example, I think I used 10,000 records. You can see the incident investigation costs were 216,000. Customer notification and crisis management was another 629. We had some PCI fines and penalties in here because there was some credit card data that was compromised. So you see the costs in there as well. And then we did, factor in a potential class action lawsuit, which was another 709. So that came to a little under $2 million for this, example. And so again, using the information that we've collected from the individual prospects or clients, again, we can get it a little bit closer to show you sort of what range of cyber you should be buying. And it's a lot better than just throwing a dart at a dartboard. So hopefully that helps. But with that, I'll open it up for some questions for myself, Wim, Ian, and the rest of the team.
Yes, awesome. Thank you, Derek. Lots of great info and stories in there. I picked up a few more things. Ian had a couple stories or current events to share from what you picked up on Twitter. So what did you have there, Ian?
Oh, those were just some general comments that we had noted was that quite often people are seeing where an IT company might present something like doing multi-factor authentication and they get turned down. And then 3 months later, they're coming back and saying, well, actually, we do have to implement this because we can't get insurance without it. And then one of the other things was around multi-factor authentication actually or insurance policies being denied or not effective without the multi-factor authentication in. So if you're clients of ours that have sat through our business technology reviews, you certainly heard us talk about multi-factor authentication, as well as the endpoint detection, the MTR, which is the managed threat response. That was one of the other things we just wanted to bring up, is that you might have antivirus and things like that installed on your computers. It's kind of to that point where, oh, we won't get attacked. But how long is that going to be before notifications are really acted on or something like that? So, in the case of a weekend, it might be several days that before somebody's going to look at an alert that might come in. So there's increased capabilities in managed threat response that can come in as well. We did have a question there. Daryl Ellens asked if it was normal to replace most of the hardware in a claim. And I guess one of the things I'd kind of highlight here, Derek, is that this is not just insurance against a ransomware attack or a cyber security incident. This is also insurance against physical hardware breaking, like your server dies or a network appliance dies or something like that as well. Is that correct?
It has to relate to a hacking event.
Okay.
So it's not just end of life. The server is end of life; it fails, and that would be covered. The hardware replacement is really only when it's tied to a ransomware attack, and the virus was so strong that it attacked the firmware, software, and basically your computers were turned into bricks. That's why we call it bricking as well. And so if that happens, this, like I said, it bridges the gap between your property policy and the cyber policy.
Yep. Yeah, if anybody has more questions, but please put them in the Q&A or in the chat. But I have some more questions here. I think you kind of touched on this, Derek, but if somebody doesn't have servers, they're not using R2P, they're not using VPNs, they're like, all my data is in Salesforce or SharePoint or Google Drive. Are there still risks involved? Do they still need to worry about insurance and being compromised if their data's in the cloud?
Yeah, because again, if those third parties, it's all about the chain of ownership of that data, right? And so, like I mentioned, you can outsource the data, but you can't outsource the risk. Meaning, if you have a data breach and all of your data is stored with third parties, your clients aren't going to go after Salesforce. They're not going to go after Amazon. They're going to go after you because you were the one that received their information. Now, what might happen in a claim scenario is that your insurer may then what we call subrogate against Salesforce or against some other third party to try to recoup their money. But at least they don't make you have to do it. You're taken care of. Take care of your own house first and foremost, and then allow the insurance company to try to recoup their money. Because if you're going up against a team of lawyers from Microsoft, it's going to be pretty tough to get any money, especially considering they have billions of clients around the world. there could be a long list of other people trying to get, compensation. Furthermore, if you review your contract with those third parties, there's likely hold harmless agreements. They're definitely not indemnifying you for data breaches and things like that. So it's going to be an uphill battle. So the best way to do that, protect your own house first through your own policy, and then let the insurance company try to recoup their money if they choose.
Yeah, good advice there. Okay, so yeah, Derek, you shared us the checklist. I guess it's from Beasley for applications, and I think it was like 5 or 6 pages. There's a lot of controls they asked for. So I guess the question for Ian is like, how do we help our clients with that, or how can we help anybody on here who is going through that process?
Yeah, so that checklist, like I alluded to at the beginning, it can form the foundations of an IT assessment or a risk assessment for your organization. We do have a pretty well-developed process that we go through with clients and potential clients in assessing their networks and providing them with an IT roadmap and recommendations on how to improve their position. If you are looking for insurance and you've got that laundry list of things that they need answers on, we can certainly help go through your systems with you and come up with the answers to those. Those assessments, they'll range kind of in a couple of thousands of dollars, and they'll generally go on for a week and a half or so.
Yeah, cool.
I would chime in as well that all of those cyber applications look pretty daunting. It's just like those 6, the 6 main questions that we're asking. Cyber application will look pretty daunting, but if you work with your internal or external IT people, it actually shouldn't take more than probably half an hour, maybe to fill out. Maybe it's even shorter, because an IT guy will know the answers to those questions just about right away. So don't be deterred. And also, I mean, I would hope other brokers are doing this too, but I always lend a hand with my clients too to go through it and articulate exactly the intent of each question, because sometimes that isn't necessarily clear. And so what I do is I have my prospects or insureds go off with their IT, take a first stab at the application. And then I always set up a call with them to run through it to try to fill in any gaps, because usually it actually is quite easier than you think.
Yeah. So is this mostly that application? Is it about disclosure, or is it looking at compliance as well? Like how many of those things need to be in place for them to be eligible for coverage? Yeah.
So the 6 main things that we highlighted, those are the ones that they're going to gravitate to immediately. So we want to focus on those especially. The other ones, it's hit or miss. So if you have some, if you don't have the others, it's very likely that you'll still get coverage. But if you don't have multi-factor authentication, you're probably not going to get coverage. If you don't have, some of the other key things that they're looking for, like if you have open ports and they're doing a scan, they won't even actually proceed to the quoting process until you've got a clean scan. So there are some roadblocks in there, but once you get past those roadblocks, it is a little bit easier to obtain the coverage.
Yeah, yeah. And of course, we recommend everyone to have insurance. Like we should have fire insurance on our house, but we also got to be smart and put the actual things in place. Don't just rely on a payout. It's like we have the fire insurance on a house, but have a smoke detector. Don't let the kids play with candles in their beds. Don't overload your circuits. Literally, I'm dealing with that right now. We've got fans in our basement to dry out the basement, and we smell burning in the circuit panels. The electrician's there, right? So don't overload your circuits. So we got to do the MFA and take the actual steps, be proactive. Yeah. Okay. And then I guess anything, Derek, specific to nonprofits in terms of any of this? Is there extra coverage or different conditions, or does it apply across the board?
Yeah, the policy would be very similar for nonprofits or for-profits. Typically, again, it depends on what type of nonprofit, how much information they're storing, things like that, depending on where they're going to fall in that risk profile. The good news for nonprofits is that typically they're on the lower end of the pricing schedule, or pricing schedule would be fair. And so again, it's an easier way to get coverage. You're probably going to have less hoops to jump through if you're a nonprofit than maybe some other more hairy businesses, let's say. So that's the good news for that side.
Yeah. And I would jump in on the nonprofit front as well and note that many of those things, the costs associated with security Many vendors, particularly Microsoft, especially, have substantial discounts on some of these security products for non-for-profits and charities. So please reach out and speak to us if you want to have a conversation about what services you may be eligible for a discount on.
Yeah. Okay, and then I had a question from somebody by email regarding does paying the ransoms encourage more ransoms? And I think the FBI says don't pay ransoms. They don't encourage that. So yeah, any thoughts on that, Derek?
Yeah, so that's obviously a social dilemma that the industry is dealing with. The same dilemma exists for kidnap and ransom insurance, right? I mean, in many ways, kidnap and ransom has involved into a pure business. So very few, let's say, of these people that are kidnapped are being hurt because they know that the money's going to be there from the mining companies or whatever that are sending their people to remote places. Well, the cyber world is very similar, and so it's a little bit tough because private businesses may go bankrupt if they're not allowed to pay. And so the government is wary to step in and tell them, yes, you have to do this, or no, you can't do that, because you're talking about a lot of money, jobs, other things that could be affected if they aren't allowed to pay. But what the government has done is they've created a little bit of like a no-fly list, basically, or a sanction list. And that's mainly in the US, where they have targeted certain hacking groups and they've put them on this sanction list, and have basically associated with them with a terrorist organization, meaning that if you are compromised by one of these groups that's now virtually being called a terrorist organization, you cannot pay them by law. If you do, you can run into some legal issues. And so that is one thing that the government is doing, is for the big offenders, the big hacking groups that have been sort of discovered, and the big offenders, they are sort of putting them on this no-fly list, which means that you can't pay, which essentially what the hacking groups are doing in that case is they're dissolving, and they are going back into the shadows and reappearing as somebody different. Because once they've been sort of blacklisted, they don't really have a business anymore. So it's a little bit of a whack-a-mole situation. But at this point, we don't expect that anybody is going to be outlawing these payments. It certainly does probably perpetuate the issue. But again, it's a little bit tricky to stop paying, because if you stop, some businesses might be negatively affected, and again, it comes back to that social dilemma.
Yeah. Okay, so I've got a couple of questions in the chat here. So a question from Tony, who operates an ISP, providing wholesale internet access, etc. Does cyber insurance cover the end user suing our ISP for errors or other liability? And then I guess related is, what's the typical cost to buy that to cover the distributed denial of service, ransomware, etc.?
Yeah, so if you're like a technology provider and you have so let's just open this question up, make it a little bit more broad to more people. So if you're a technology provider and your product fails, that's actually not a cyber related loss. That would be a professional liability loss, right? So if you're a managed service provider and you have some sort of issue and your clients are negatively affected, you also would have a professional liability policy, right? And so that's what we would expect to respond in that case. So if ultimately the end user suffers some sort of financial loss as a result of your not delivering as you were supposed to, so your product fails, that could fall under sort of an E&O. If it's related to some sort of hacking event, it could fall under a cyber. And that's why technology providers have a technology, what's called a technology package policy. So they actually have their E&O and their cyber under one policy, and they share the same limit, because there can be some gray area in there as to which insuring agreement it needs to fall under. If you're not in the technology space, you would expect to find cyber provided to you on a standalone basis. So there would be no E&O component combined. So that's the first part of the question, I think, that was asked. It sort of depends on the type of claim, whether it falls under an E&O or a cyber. But certainly there could be some liability there if your product fails and they ultimately suffer a financial loss, they being the client. I think the question, Wim, was, how much a policy would cost potentially for
Yes,
cyber
yeah.
or for E&O.
Yeah.
That would be more a little bit trickier to answer, because we need to see the application, we need to see the revenue, we need to see what clientele and what services you're offering that too. So it's hard to say over this call, but certainly we could take that offline and go through that process. But it is a little bit hard to just come up with a number off the top of my head.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough. So maybe, yeah, Tony and Derek, maybe we can connect up afterwards, and I can set up an introduction and can answer that.
Sure.
Then Bora had a question about, for a public school, is there anything unique for cyber insurance coverage? So I'm
Public
not sure
schools,
where she is located. I don't know if that matters.
what's the rough geographical area?
Did she put it in the chat? Bora, do you mind to put in the chat where you are?
US, California.
California, yeah.
I can speak a little bit more knowledgeably to the Canadian market, which I'm sure is very similar to the US market. Educational institutions are very difficult to play cyber for right now, because they do have a lot of claims. There's a lot of kids hacking into the system. There's a lot of sensitive student information. There's a lot of just historical claims data on schools. So we do work with a number of schools here in British Columbia. For one, I am dealing with a fairly decent size school. I think they have, they're definitely up there in revenue, maybe in the 30 to 50 million range of revenue. But they have a 5 million limit right now, and they're trying to get 10 million. And I just can't find an option at this point for them. So I'm struggling to find up to 10 million. The first 5 I was able to get through one company. And now when we're trying to find excess limits, it's a little bit trickier. So it's a roundabout way to answer the question. It's a difficult space. It's not impossible to find insurance. As a result of it being difficult, you could expect the pricing to be higher. Between municipalities, schools, healthcare, that's where we're seeing a real focus from the insurers, because that's traditionally where we've seen the most claims.
Yeah. So hope that was helpful there, Bora, or you can put a follow-up question or comment in the chat there. And then Tony also asked about.
I was just going to say that because Bora was US based, we do have colleagues. I have a colleague that sits in San Francisco that is extremely knowledgeable on the topic. And so if wanting to discuss further, because he's licensed in the US, especially in California, I can definitely make those introductions if it's of interest.
Yeah. Good, thank you. Yeah, and then Tony also asked about vendors requiring customers to buy insurance and add the vendor's name in the policy. I've had that with some clients, some clients, large companies, like billion-dollar companies, requiring me. They want to. It's right in the agreement contract. Is they want the specific coverages, and it's just like their lawyers have a template agreement, and you got to have coverage and their limits in their language. So I just kind of negotiate it. I'm like, delete what they got and I put in my standard block that I have. So I don't want to be changing my insurance policy every month when I sign up another client. So I think it is negotiable, and I've pushed back on adding their name to my policy. But our broker has been happy to do that as well. So that's been my experience. It's these large companies, their lawyers have a boilerplate contract, and they throw it out, or send it out to you, expect you to just sign it, but it's all negotiable. So I know your thoughts on that, Derek.
Yeah, so my answer would change depending on what side of the border you're on. If you're in the US, it is much more common to add a third party or a vendor to your E&O and cyber policy. They do allow for that additional insured status. It's a lot more common in the US. In Canada, it's less common, but it is still possible. Some insurers do allow for that additional insured status. But the thing is from a risk management standpoint, every time you allow someone to be an additional insured on your policy, you're in a way eroding your own limit, because you're now granting them access to your limits. And if they swallow up, 50% of your limit or 75% of the limit, that only leaves you 25% left or 50% left. So you have to be mindful that you're only allowing absolutely, the main people onto your policy, and try to push back where necessary. Because again, the more people that you add, the quicker your limits are going to erode in the event of a claim.
Yep. Okay, I think that covered all the questions in the chat. So recap, I could ask more questions, but we're getting close to the top of the hour and I want to respect people's time there. So yeah, 3 steps, make sure you got good coverage, have the discussions. If your current provider doesn't have any sort of checklist like this, like the 6-page, or it's just based on your revenue number of employees, that might be a red flag right there. If it's just so rudimentary, they haven't sent anything and any questionnaire, that could be an issue there. Probably have nothing. Discuss an assessment project. So we can do that both on Linux servers, on Windows networks, cloud systems, 365, for a few $1,000s to invest in that and know where you're at, what are the gaps, and then create a roadmap. It doesn't all have to be solved in the first week or first month. It could be done over a year or 2 years. It's taking steps. It might be, hey, let's get the MFA in place. Let's change some of these firewall policies. Let's look at who has administrator access to various accounts and come up with a roadmap. And there's, just covering the basic hygiene first before we get carried away. But definitely always want to be taking steps every quarter to close the gap, strengthen the defenses. So anything else to add, Ian or Derek?
If you have open RDP or aren't using MFA, don't wait a year to fix that.
Yeah. How many systems have we added MFA to, Ian? Like, what do you have in your authenticator in your phone?
Oh,
30 or 40? I don't know.
Yeah, at least 2 dozen. Yeah.
Yeah.
So it's important.
Yeah, so we've rolled that out extensively. Yeah. Okay. Well, thank you everyone for showing up here and participating in the questions. And if you got follow-ups, you got our information, shoot me an email or Ian, and we'll provide the info. So we'll also be sending out the recording. So if you want to share it with your partners or clients or your team, you're welcome to do so. And with that, I'll wrap it up. Thank you, Derek, for helping out. Thank you, Ian.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for hosting.
Yep.
Bye.
You're welcome. All right.